Paul Newman's piercing blue eyes were Hollywood's most effective camouflage, masking a man of ironclad moral principles who spent his entire career at war with the industry's darker impulses. While the Golden Age is often remembered through a haze of glamour, for Newman, it was a political battlefield where he stood as a radical outlier. He didn't just play rebels on screen. He was a rebel in the boardrooms and on the picket lines, fundamentally unable to stomach the bigotry of his peers. Today, we delve into the deep ideological rift of that era, focusing on the 9 actors Newman couldn't stand, men whose exclusionary politics and deep-seated prejudices represented the very rut he fought to prune from the American spirit. 1. John Wayne, the clash of masculinities. John Wayne was the ultimate symbol of the old guard, a man whose hypermasculine, frontier archetypes defined American identity for decades. To Paul Newman, however, Wayne wasn't a hero. He was a dangerous relic who romanticized a version of history that erased the struggle of the marginalized. The tension between them reached a fever pitch following Wayne's infamous 1971 Playboy interview, where the Duke expressed support for white supremacy until blacks are educated to a point of responsibility. Newman, who had stood on the front lines of the 1963 March on Washington, viewed Wayne's rhetoric as a moral poison. He famously critiqued the Duke's brand of heroism as a cardboard fantasy, preferring the gritty, flawed realism of his own characters like Fast Eddie Felson. To Newman, Wayne wasn't just an actor with different views. He was the architect of a regressive American mythology that Newman spent his entire career trying to dismantle through nuanced, intellectual performances. 2. Walter Brennan, the reality of the cracker persona. Walter Brennan was the only actor to win 3 Academy Awards for Best Supporting Actor. But behind the camera, his lovable crank persona was a thin veil for hardline segregationist beliefs. Brennan was notorious for his extreme right-wing activism, particularly his vocal opposition to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. On the set of The Real McCoys, Brennan was known to be a difficult, ideologically rigid presence, frequently clashing with anyone who didn't share his Old South sensibilities. Newman, who viewed acting as a medium for empathy, found Brennan's worldview repulsive. He reportedly avoided Brennan at social functions, viewing the elder actor's celebration of social unrest in black communities as a betrayal of the humanistic potential of cinema. For Newman, Brennan's talent didn't excuse his bigotry. It only made it more dangerous, as it gave a polished face to the era's most destructive prejudices. 3. Ward Bond, the blacklist chief investigator. Ward Bond was a powerhouse character actor and a fixture in John Ford's westerns, but his most significant role was as the enforcement arm of the Hollywood blacklist. As a leader of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, MPA, Bond was essentially a self-appointed witch hunter who took it upon himself to investigate the political leanings of his colleagues. He was known to carry a little black book of names, ensuring that anyone with even a hint of liberal or subversive leanings would never find work again. Newman, who came of age as an actor during the Red Scare, viewed Bond as a moral coward and a bully. He saw Bond's actions as a direct assault on the First Amendment and artistic freedom. To Newman, Bond represented a form of corporate fascism that turned Hollywood into a panopticon of fear, a system that Newman spent decades resisting by working with blacklisted writers like Dalton Trumbo. 4. Adolphe Menjou, fashionable fascism. Adolphe Menjou was often cited as the best-dressed man in America, but his impeccable tailoring hid a fiery, reactionary soul that Paul Newman found deeply unsettling. Menjou was a founding member of the MPA and one of the most enthusiastic friendly witnesses to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, WAC. In his testimony, Menjou unrepentantly labeled himself a witch hunter, stating that he had seen movies, specifically the pro-Stalinist mission to Moscow, that he believed should never have been made. Newman, who valued intellectual diversity above all else, viewed Menjou's willingness to censor and dress down his colleagues as a stain on the industry. The contrast was stark. Menjou used his urbanity to uphold a rigid, exclusionary status quo, while Newman used his own polished image to smuggle radical ideas about government overreach and individual liberty into the mainstream. 5. Robert Taylor, the burden of the friendly witness. Robert Taylor was one of MGM's biggest stars, but his legacy was forever tarnished in Newman's eyes by his voluntary cooperation with WAC. While some actors were subpoenaed and forced to testify, Taylor was viewed as a friendly witness who went above and beyond, naming names and identifying pink scripts that he believed contained communist propaganda. To Newman, Taylor's compliance wasn't just a political choice. It was a psychological betrayal of the acting community. Newman believed that an actor's integrity was their only true currency, and seeing Taylor trade that integrity for studio protection was something he could never respect. This divide poisoned the social fabric of Hollywood for decades, and Newman remained one of the few who refused to forgive and forget, maintaining a cold professional distance from those who had facilitated the ruin of their peers' lives. 6. Ginger Rogers, the matriarch of the blacklist. While Ginger Rogers is celebrated for her dancing and her backwards and in high heels work ethic, Newman couldn't stand the aggressive anti-leftist crusade spearheaded by her and her mother, Leela Rogers. Leela was a founding member of the MPA and testified as a friendly witness, famously claiming that the film None But the Lonely Heart was subversive because it was too gloomy. Ginger Rogers herself was a staunch supporter of the blacklist, often using her star power to ensure that writers with progressive leanings were kept away from major productions. For Newman, who believed that the best art came from the margins, Rogers' attempt to sanitize and gatekeep the industry was an unforgivable sin against the craft. He viewed the Rogers family's influence as a form of cultural sterilization that prioritized safe propaganda over the complicated truths of the human condition. 7. George Murphy, the song and dance operative. George Murphy was the song and dance man who successfully pivoted from musicals to the United States Senate, becoming a key architect of the Hollywood to Washington pipeline. Murphy was an influential leader of Hollywood's conservative bloc and a mentor to a young Ronald Reagan, guiding him through the complexities of industry politics. Newman, who would later become one of the most vocal critics of the Reagan-era social policies, viewed Murphy as the ultimate corporate company man. He saw Murphy as someone who valued the brand and the party over the human being, using his dapper persona to lobby for policies that Newman felt were stripping away the safety nets of the American public. To Newman, Murphy represented the beginning of the performative politician, a trend he spent his life fighting by ensuring his own activism was rooted in tangible, quiet philanthropy rather than political theater. 8. Ronald Reagan, the T-10 informant. Long before he was president, Ronald Reagan was the president of the Screen Actors Guild, and it was during this time that he served as a secret FBI informant under the code name T-10. Reagan provided the government with names of suspected communists within his own union, a betrayal that Paul Newman found deeply personal. Although they maintained a thin veneer of professional respect in later years, Newman's entire philanthropic and political life was a direct rebuttal to the world Reagan helped build. Newman saw Reagan as a man who had moved from acting on a sound stage to acting out a political agenda that favored the wealthy at the expense of the vulnerable. Their rivalry was the ultimate battle for the soul of the leading man. Reagan represented a return to a nostalgic, exclusionary past, while Newman represented a push toward a diverse, compassionate future. 9. Charles Coburn, the voice of segregation. Charles Coburn was a beloved character actor, but behind his monocle and jovial grin lay a hardline opposition to the very foundations of the civil rights movement. Coburn was a prominent member of the MPA and a vocal opponent of integrated housing and labor unions in Hollywood. For Newman, who lived a life of radical inclusivity, Coburn's beliefs were not just old-fashioned. They were an active threat to the progress of the industry. Newman believed that the golden age was built on the backs of those Coburn wished to exclude, and he made it a point to use his own production companies to ensure a more equitable hiring environment.